very, very, very warm welcome to all of you, for everybody that is watching live and for everybody that will be watching this in the future. Thank you. First of all, thank you so much. I know that I say it for those who have come to events that I host before. I'm like a broken record, but I always really just feel it's important to recognize that our time, is so precious. And I'm truly appreciative that everybody is taking their very, very valuable time so generously to share in being with and being open to and interested in this topic that we're going to be speaking about today. So important, and it is with an absolute tremendous amount of pleasure that we get to have the presentation and the discussion with Ruth Millman and Danny van Deurzen-Smith. Like we've just been saying before we started recording, this is such a passion for both of them, and the way that they present. As soon as I was thinking who shall I invite for the 2024, I thought let's start with these guys, because the way that they present is so it's so heartfelt, it's so passionate, it combines such clarity and such creativity and some research, some less formal. I'm not gonna spoil it, but because you're gonna see for yourself in a minute. But I am just so excited for the fact that they have agreed to join us. And yes, thank you all so much for taking the time to be here today, whether that's live or whether that's in the future. So I'm not going to whittle on, because I can very, very easily do that. But instead, what I would like to do is I will with a warm welcome introduce Ruth and Danny, and invite you guys to introduce yourselves however that might feel right for you, and to hand over to you for the presentation when you're ready.
Thanks very much, Natalie. It's really lovely to be here with you all. The stuff that Natalie's doing, I was just chatting with her before. I think it's incredibly cool, and so it's a real joy for us to be part of it and to be with you this evening. Although it might not be this evening for some of you, depending on where you are in the old globe, and for those of you on the recording. So I'm Ruth. I am a counselling psychologist. I'm an existential psychotherapist. I'm also a queer and neurodivergent person. And I have been working in this kind of field for nearly 18 years now. And then I met Danny about, I don't know, I can't even know how long it's been, maybe 6-7 years now.
Must be.
And our adventure into the existential world of neurodivergence kind of began and became a pet project for us for a while. I'll hand over to Danny in a moment to introduce themselves, but just to set the scene, feel free to make yourself as comfortable as possible this evening. If you want to have your cameras off, that's absolutely fine. You can have your mic off, that's absolutely fine. If you want to get up, have a drink, have a rock, do whatever you need to do, grab a pet, all of that stuff is absolutely fine for us.
Grabbing a pet is particularly encouraged, because we really like to see the pets.
Yes, always encouraging pets. So just to kind of put that out there, it's going to be an informal session. We're going to chat through some slides. And in that time, if we're going to keep an eye on the chat, because Danny and I will kind of take turns. So if you've got kind of thoughts that come up, feel free to pop them in the chat and we'll answer them as we go. And then when we've got to the end, we'll have a chance to kind of just ask questions and discuss more generally. Danny, do you want to give yourself a quick intro, and then I'll
yeah. So I'm Danny. I am an existential coach. I'm currently the deputy principal at the School of Psychotherapy and Counselling, which always feels slightly terrifying to say. And I also head the MA in Existential Coaching there. And one thing that I always try to do in our coaching programs is to introduce these topics, these issues around intersectionality, around diversity, because we all have some kind of diversity, and it's a really important part of client work to understand that, to understand those different perspectives, to understand our own diversity, our own perspective, and the diversity that our clients are bringing in. It's partly selfish as well, though, because I am also queer and autistic. So I come from that particular perspective myself. So, you know, one might read it as slightly narcissistic, I suppose, that to this particular topic. But I try not to think about that too much. So, yeah, I've been working with Ruth, as she said, I think pretty much since we met, because we both had this interest in neurodiversity. And in this link between neurodiversity and queerness. So we're going to be talking quite a bit about that today, the overlap, how those things intersect with each other or don't intersect with each other, and really explore this beautiful idea of these kind of liminal spaces that we sometimes sit in.
Beautiful, thank you, Danny. Right, the slides that I have, I'm very happy to share with folks, so I can send them to Natalie, and if people want them and that's possible to share them, that's absolutely fine. Okay, so we are going to kick off with some definitions. There are quite a few definitions, which can feel a bit overwhelming, and I'm conscious of that, and I use all these kind of different definitions and acronyms on a daily basis. So I think it's quite important just to spend a bit of time talking about them, and also talking about the fact that it doesn't matter if we get it wrong. It's more about the fact that we're trying to kind of understand, and we're trying to approach them in a way that is respectful to the people that we're engaging with. And also just exploring the nature of how language develops and what that means about, you know, the way that we're relating to ourselves as humans. I think there's a kind of huge element of that as well. So just to kind of set the scene, thinking about neurodiversity, I'm sure many of you are familiar with this term now, but just in case any of you aren't, in the kind of 1990s, this term first developed, initially kind of in online autistic communities, actually, although it kind of came together in a variety of spaces. And it was the idea that there is a natural variation in the way that our brains function and in the way that we sensorily engage in the world. And rather than seeing this in a kind of pathologizing, medicalizing way, actually seeing it as a natural occurrence in the same way that we might see variations in hair color, for example. And the term neurodiversity came from that, so neuro and diversity. Neurodivergent is the term for those people whose brains, whose neurological systems are set up in a way that is different to the majority of people. So the majority of people, brains are set up in a similar way, and there are neurotypicals, and those whose brains are set up in a less familiar way. So a minority of people are the neurodivergent folks. And within that, we see a number of different diagnoses. So dyspraxia, ADHD, autism, dyscalculia, Tourette's, dyslexia. There are also others as well. So it's not a ring-fenced, gate-kept term. It's a term that's been developed by people in the community. So some things like bipolar, schizophrenia, also are included because they equally have differences in terms of sensory experience and the way that brains function. And so when we're thinking of this, we're thinking about these differences, and people will often may use various kind of terms when relating to themselves. It does vary. So now, as you may have gathered, within that basket of different terms, there is a huge variety. And obviously, in all humans, there is massive nuance and massive variation. You know, the way that an autistic person experiences themselves in the world, the way that a dyslexic person experiences themselves in the world will vary massively. Having said that, there are features that are similar throughout all of those people who would come under the neurodivergent bandwagon. Now, partly it's to do with differences in terms of communication, also differences in terms of relating, as well as differences in terms of sensory experience. And so I've picked out, there are three kind of key features that I think we generally see across all neurodivergent folks. One of this is differences in terms of executive functioning. And executive functioning is the part of our prefrontal cortex. So our kind of this part of the brain, and it's to do with our kind of brain's personal assistant, our PA. It's our organization, it's our remembering of things, it's our ability to meta think. And most neurodivergent folks will have differences in terms of how they do that. Now, Danny and I are a perfect combination of this. I often describe Danny as my external hard drive because I have a horrendous working memory, and my memory itself is pretty poor. Danny has a fabulous memory and pretty much can remember anything, but struggles more with prioritization, which I'm quite good with. So together, kind of one semi-functioning human. So we can see here some of these features of executive functioning, and you can have a think in your own, in your own mind as to how do you relate to these different aspects. So flexible thinking, emotion control, impulse control, problem solving, task initiation, planning and prioritizing, self-monitoring. And we can kind of get a sense here of how, and that can make a big difference in terms of how you engage with the world. And so some neurodivergent folks will be really good in terms of their memory, others will struggle with it. Some will be really good with flexible thinking, others will be much better thinking strategically. So we see a variety within this. I love this. Yeah, I love this cartoon. I put it in anytime I can, really. So the big thing here is about differences in communication, and we're going to talk about this more later on. But it's that for many neurodivergent folks, the way they communicate is different to the average neurotypical person. For example, that many autistic folks prefer to have direct, specific, very clear information, whereas often neurotypical folks are more likely to use non-verbal communication cues, more likely to have slightly ambiguous use of language, and more contextually focused language. So what we're talking about here is just differences in styles of communicating. There may be someone who is dyslexic or dyspraxic who will much prefer being able to communicate using pictures or using photos or using imagery of other kinds, because that's the preference in terms of how their brain works. So the key thing here is just about the differences in communication preference. And then again, we can think about what that means in terms of how you experience the world and how others experience you. And then the final kind of main difference that we see is to do with sensory differences. And lots of neurodivergent folks are hypersensitive or hyposensitive in a variety of different ways. Again, Danny and I are great examples of this. So I have what's called poor proprioception, which is your ability to know where you are in space. And as a consequence, I like to have very tight things around my body all the time because it helps me to have a sense of where I am. And Danny is kind of the opposite of that. So, and you'll notice that it's not just to do with taste and touch and sound and smell. It's also to do with proprioception, as I mentioned, vestibular, which is our balance, our sense of balance, and interoception, which is being able to know what's going on inside the body, whether that's to do with how hungry you are, or whether that's to do with being able to really hone in and articulate how you're feeling. Now, I'm going to just touch on a few other key themes when it comes to neurodivergence. And then Danny is going to take over and talk a bit about the gender and sexuality. And then we're going to talk about how that intersects, if that's going to come up too, how that intersects. And then we're going to end by chatting through some ideas around, firstly, why existentialism fits rather beautifully, in our opinion, when it comes to this bunch of folks, and secondly, things that can be useful when you're working with people. So, having said that, emotions and empathy, the reason I think this is such a crucial one to highlight is that there have been myths perpetuating for many years that individuals who are autistic in particular, but neurodivergent as well, lack emotions or lack empathy. And the reality is that's just not true. It was based on a very specific kind of biased view of what we mean by empathy. And in fact, lots of neurodivergent people are highly empathetic and emotionally sensitive. It's just that they may express that differently or experience it differently to the majority of neurotypical people that they may be surrounded by. Partly this is kind of linked to what I was talking about before in terms of interoception. So differences in sensing into your body can mean that it requires kind of different connections to be able to express what's going on. For example, I work with a lot of people in quite a creative way, and we will kind of talk about and map out emotions using colors or using animals or using various other imagery and concepts. Because the standard kind of emotional words don't really hold any kind of resonance or meaning. And that's not because they're not emotional, it's just because their connection to their emotion is different. This is another one of my fave illustrations by Super Spectrum Girl. In terms of what society thinks I can feel, nothing just like a rock. What I can actually feel, all the feels, all the feelings. And I've had many, many clients who said that to me, that their experience of their emotional inner world is intense, which can be both something that they find great solace and inspiration from, and also can be something that can be really challenging, particularly when others aren't understanding your inner experience. Okay, another kind of key thing to know when we are thinking about neurodivergent folks. So the double empathy problem was created by an autistic academic called Damien Milton. If you want to go and do some deep dives, Damien is one of your peeps to have a read up on. And Damien basically flipped this idea that autistic folks can't understand others, that they struggle to know what's going on. And Damien was like, well, hold on a minute. Is it that autistic people can't understand others? Or is it that actually this is a two-way thing, and that non-autistic people are also pretty rubbish at understanding what's going on for autistic folks? And I mean, it's so true, isn't it? That when you say it out loud, it kind of seems it's obvious. Of course, it's got to be a two-way thing. However, this was pretty revolutionary in terms of autistic and neurodivergent thinking, and super important in understanding the kind of layers of discrimination that had gone on in terms of pathologizing autistic and later neurodivergent folks in general, as these theories got translated to the wider neurodivergent community. So it's the fact that non-autistic people often will make assumptions about autistic folks. There is a ton of science on that around bias and discriminating initial impressions. Also find it really difficult to understand the autistic inner experience and sensory experience. Whereas for the autistic person, they may find it difficult to read between the neurotypical milieu and social norms, which we will talk about more. But again, it's this kind of cross-cultural thing that's coming up here, which again kind of has another layer of complexity when we add into it an additional minority status like being LGBTQIA+. So just the last little thing that I think is really helpful for all of us is that there is a massive variation in how individuals experience their neurodivergence. People will use different terminology. So they might use ASPI, AUTI, neurodivergent. Others will have a variety of those things. So it's very much about checking in with whoever it is that you are supporting, working with, having a conversation with, listening to what it is that capture or they prefer in terms of those things. Generally speaking, autistic person is the preference that's come from the autistic community. And that's partly to do with a caution around saying you're a person with autism, in the same way as you might say, you know, you're a person with a handbag. The idea that was coming from autistic advocates, and then more broadly neurodivergent advocates, is that actually this is part of who I am. This is my way of being. You don't say I'm a person with bisexuality. That would be very odd. I say I'm a bisexual person. So it's kind of keying into that understanding about how people are. Having said that, and this was a conversation that I had with a student recently, there is real nuance. So for some folks, being disabled and being identified as having a disability is something that is very important to their sense of self. It's very important that that is acknowledged. For others, they wouldn't want that term associated, or they don't identify with that term at all. So we need to be able to hold this tension. We need to be able to hold this nuance. The last bit I'm going to note here, and then I shall hand over to Danny, is to do with self-diagnosis. There, some of you, I'm sure, are kind of aware that, you know, in the last 10 years or so, there's been so much more awareness around neurodiversity, which is very, very cool. And it's been exciting to kind of see what's happening, particularly kind of see neurodivergent academics and professionals kind of writing and sharing their experience. However, there has also been a bit of a backlash, if I'm honest, in terms of other members of society acting in very defensive or angry ways about the fact that there's a greater number of people identifying with neurodivergent labels, concepts. And so, and one of the things that comes up is around self-diagnosis. I think it's really important to highlight that for many people, getting a diagnosis is really tricky, and actually accessibility to that is extremely difficult in most parts of the world. In the UK, there is waiting lists of over a year, 2 years on the NHS. And to go privately, that means that you will need to pay a lot of money to go privately to get an assessment. And so, of course, what that means is that it's just not possible for a lot of people. And so having a sensitivity around that and understanding why someone may self-identify, self-diagnose, and the nuance of that and the way that sits within kind of structures of privilege, I think is really important. Right, I'm going to pause. Danny, over to you.
Yes, here is the bit where I spread the gay agenda that everybody's so scared of. So I'm going to talk through a bit around gender and sexuality, different identities there, assuming no sort of foundational knowledge, because I think a lot of the time the mistake that we make with this is assuming that everybody's kind of on the same place in their journey with understanding these different identities. So I'm going to talk through that a little bit first. So this is the genderbread person. Importantly, the genderbread person version 3.3. The genderbread person has evolved to its third form. So this is a way of kind of looking at different elements of queerness, kind of isolating them and looking at perhaps what our own experiences of them might be. So this is a slightly more nuanced one than the original and second genderbread person. It's a little subtler. So on the one hand, you've got this idea of gender identity. So that's how you, in your own head, define your gender. It's your personal experience, how much you align or don't align with womanness or manness. And so instead of the original genderbread person, which had it on a spectrum of womanness to manness, and you kind of place the slider somewhere in between those two identities, here you've got separate sliders for womanness and manness. And they've actually provided some different examples, which you can't see that clearly on the slide, but The sort of top left one is an idea of what somebody's who identifies as a woman might look like. And you can see it's not just putting woman all the way up and man all the way down. There's some variation there, because actually even folks who identify in a more binary way, there's still often a lot of subtlety and nuance to the sort of degrees to which they align with womanness or manness, even if they identify as cisgender. And I think that's a really important point. So this is about how we kind of personally conceive of ourselves, our internal sense of identity. Then you've got gender expression, which is how we present ourselves to the outside world. So it is very possible to have a gender identity that is very different to our gender expression for all sorts of reasons. So again, you can see there's different ways of kind of conceiving this on these different scales of feminine and masculine. So you have on the top left there the kind of idea of butchness, so perhaps identifying more with masculinity in terms of gender expression, presenting in a more masculine way, with femininity being a bit lower, and then femme next to it being obviously the kind of other side of that spectrum. And then you've got some other examples, so an example around androgyny, and you can see even on the androgynous one there's some subtle variation between how that person is identifying. So it's not just both of them in the middle. There's a bit more nuance, a bit more subtlety, perhaps a bit more identification with one or the other. And that, of course, might be fluid as well. That might shift from day to day. Then you've got biological sex. So this is physical sex characteristics that either you're born with and develop, or that you have surgical intervention to change, or, you know, all of these kind of physical characteristics, so primary and secondary sex characteristics. So that will include things like your genitalia, your body shape, the pitch of your voice, body hair, where that appears, how that appears, hormones, chromosomes, etc. Now, of course, most of us have no idea what our hormones and chromosomes are, so we're kind of just guessing. But the other bits, we should have a good idea of what our genitalia are, for example. So then you've got femaleness and maleness based on those primary and secondary sex characteristics. We will talk a little bit about intersex identities later. I'm trying to remember if the slide that I'm thinking of is actually in there, but we will come back to that in a second, because it's not just a case of outright femaleness or maleness. There is a lot of kind of in between with this. And actually far more people than we might realise who fall somewhere in between. And then we've got sexual attraction and romantic attraction. And I would like to just praise the asexual community for a moment for having these discussions, because I think they've really led the way on a lot of these kind of differences between sexual attraction and romantic attraction, and actually that those are not necessarily the same thing. With a lot of straight identities, we tend to assume that they're the same thing, that if somebody is sexually attracted to women, for example, that they're also romantically attracted to women. But actually, this shows that there's some variation in that. So some people might be sexually attracted to men, but actually more romantically attracted to women, for example. Or they might have absolutely no sexual attraction, but really experience romantic attraction, or vice versa. So just thinking about our attraction with that kind of nuance can be really helpful, actually, and quite liberating, I think. So just to go over a few of the definitions around the sort of LGBTQ plus acronyms to make sure that everybody's on the same page. So most people know about the first four. So L for lesbian, G for gay, B for bisexual, and T for transgender. And just to say, transgender is an umbrella term, which includes binary trans people and non-binary trans people, as well as certain kind of indigenous identities that are a bit more, well, anything other than cisgender, basically. And I will talk about those in just a moment a little bit more too. Then you've got the Q, which can stand for either queer or questioning. So queer, again, being the kind of umbrella term that you'll often hear for describing these huge variances in identity. Some people, again, just a note around terminology, some people don't like the word queer for various reasons. I know several people who are in an older generation who don't like it because it was used as a slur against them growing up. So it's a sort of a reclaimed slur. So it's just important to be aware of that sometimes that's an issue for people. Then we've got I, which is for intersex. So those whose primary and secondary sex characteristics fall outside of the kind of standard binary. Then we have A, which is the asexual spectrum. And you can see there's lots of possible identities there as well as abrosexual, which isn't actually in the asexual spectrum, but this is a very inclusive breakdown of the letters. So there's lots of different asexual identities and also agender identities too. And then you've got P for pansexual or polysexual. So pansexual being, again, there's a little bit of contentious dialogue sometimes between pansexuals and bisexuals, and actually I think the overlap is probably pretty large, but pansexuality being this idea of being attracted to people regardless of gender, that gender isn't a factor that plays into it. And then you've got the plus, which covers other identities that might not be captured by this, and so there you've got an example of omnisexual. Now, this map I am a big fan of. There are various maps like this available on the internet. But this is a kind of breakdown of just a handful of the kind of diversity of sexual orientation and gender identity throughout culture and throughout history. So the thing that I find really fascinating about this is just how ubiquitous this experience of diverse identities when it comes to sexual orientation, when it comes to gender identity, are that they've existed through all of these different time periods, all of these different cultures, and the way in which those cultures have kind of affirmed or interacted with those identities. So I'll read you some examples because this image never quite shows up great on slides. It's very difficult to read. So I have my zoomed in version here. So you have one example of Native American.
Everybody, I had a slight moment and accidentally locked us onto the wrong slide. So
oh, did you?
Yeah. Just as you're about to go through it.
Excellent, excellent work.
Oh, superbly done. We're on fine form today. We're on fine form. Bear with.
It's very professional.
I know. So we need some kind of like lift music. Right, we're there now. We're
Excellent.
Like nothing happened.
So, Native American Great Plains tribes viewed gender on a spectrum from male to female, which included transgender and intersex persons. And actually, transgender and intersex persons in those societies were often considered to have a special spiritual significance. So we're actually quite highly regarded. You've also got let's find an interesting one. So in Albania, women who identified as Bernesha, who take a chastity vow at a long age, can live as men and assume traditionally male roles in society and in their family. Then you've got 1st century BCE to 1st century CE. In Korea, songs and poems from the ancient Silla dynasty spoke of affection among men, especially among a group of elite male warriors. And of course, we know that that the Romans had a sort of similar thing going on. Then we've got I don't know how to pronounce this properly, so I apologize. I think it's the Bugis ethnic group, which is an Indonesian native group in the island of Sulawesi. And they recognize 3 sexes, male, female, and hermaphrodite, and 4 genders, women, men, trans women, and a 5th metagender group called the Bisu. So these are just a few examples on this map, and this map isn't even a sort of exhaustive illustration of the diversity. But you know, one of the things that often comes up around sexual identity and gender identity is this idea that it's all very new. And actually, it's not all very new. It's all been around since the dawn of time, cross-culturally, in rich and wonderful ways. So I just think it's important to highlight that, and also to think about the implications in terms of cross-cultural work as well, that in other cultures, there might be a very, very different attitude towards gender or sexuality, and that actually being open to that, being sort of fluid and flexible with the approach that we take to it is really important in terms of being affirming to different cultures as well as just different people. So now we get this overlap between neurodivergence and LGBTQ plus identities, and I just dropped my pen. But it's okay, I don't need it. I was just toying with it in a sort of autistic way because I needed to stim with something. So now I'm probably going to rock because I don't have my pen to stim with. Okay. So people who don't identify with the sex that they were assigned at birth, so people who are in some way transgender, are 3 to 6 times as likely to be autistic as cisgender people are. That is a huge overlap. That is a huge, significant piece of data around that intersectionality. Also, gender diverse people are more likely to report autism traits or to suspect that they have undiagnosed autism. So that's 24% versus 5%. So again, really significant numbers here. And then we've got this kind of cross study analysis, 17 different studies, also showing a higher prevalence of gender diversity in ADHD populations, which is really under-researched. There isn't anywhere near as much around this correlation between ADHD and gender diversity as there is around autism and gender diversity. But I think there's something really intriguing about this idea of neurodivergence in general being linked to this kind of openness, I guess, to exploring one's identity a little bit differently, a little less kind of shoehorned in to the kind of standard social norms, the standard social scripts, perhaps a little bit more fluid. Then we also got this study which showed that the autistic group in the study, 69.7%, so nearly 70% of the sample reported being non-heterosexual, as opposed to 30% in the other group. So again, huge numbers here, and this is around sexuality rather than gender. So for both, a huge overlap for autistic experience of being basically non-cishet. And then you have this study that basically shows that a very, very small portion of, I think this was an exclusively female sample, basically only 8% of them identified as exclusively heterosexual. So this was autistic females. And then you've got more around kind of ADHD research. So an ADHD group of both males and females who again had a significantly higher preference for same-sex or either sex partners. So, you know, all through here, we're seeing a massive overlap between neurodivergence and LGBTQIA plus identities. Now, a little bit around the implications for this in terms of mental health. So there is a much higher prevalence of different mental health diagnoses for both neurodivergent and for LGBTQ plus people, and also a higher prevalence of suicidality as well. Then you've got this National Autistic Society study in 2020 showing that 94% of autistic people were experiencing anxiety and 83% experiencing depression. I mean, this is absolutely a huge, vast majority of the autistic population really struggling with these things. 41% of LGBTQ young people seriously considered attempting suicide in the past year. That's from the Trevor Project in 2023 study. And we've got loads of issues as well that can compound this of misdiagnosis for neurodivergent people. So it's very, very common for neurodivergent people before they get their neurodivergent diagnosis to have prior diagnoses on their record that actually have kind of just been used to label a certain set of behaviours or a certain set of experiences, but that might not actually be an appropriate diagnosis, and it later kind of emerges that their neurodivergence is the reason for those sets of behaviours. So very common for things like EUPD to be on an autistic person's medical record before they get their autism diagnosis, because they're perceived as not being able to respond in an emotionally appropriate way, whatever that means exactly. And a general lack of research and therefore barriers to services as well. So, this population who already are likely to have this double minority status, the implications of that being in that double minority status are, pretty serious in terms of mental health outcomes. So, what is the reason for this? Well, it's likely to be around this idea of minority stress. So, and I think this is really important as well, because a lot of the dialogue around, particularly around autistic people and gender diversity, it kind of goes to this narrative of autistic people are just like really sensitive, and we're like really unable to consent to things and really unable to know ourselves. And that it's just a kind of inherent mental health issue that we have. And really, it's not about that. It's about this idea of minority stress. So when you're in a minority group, you experience these stresses that influence your health outcomes. These kinds of stresses that people who are not in those minority groups won't experience. So this is a model from Monique Botha, who is a fabulous non-binary, disabled and neurodivergent academic. And they came up with this model specifically looking at neurodivergent identity and neuronormative culture. There are other similar models for different minority stresses as well, and it maps over pretty nicely. So on the one hand, you have that social status. So that's what you begin with, this difference, this neurodivergence in a neuronormative culture. We could also sub in queerness in a heteronormative culture as well, and basically any other minority. So you then encounter these stresses that occur just in the world. So that might be things like outright prejudice events. So, kind of hate crime experiences, things that are on the more extreme end of the spectrum that perhaps other people might be more clued into without being able to sort of identify some of the subtle microaggressions that might happen. And then you've got everyday discrimination, which is quite different to that. The things that probably a lot of people don't notice, that are little microaggressions, little ways that people get discriminated against that really mount up. And of course, it's easy to then start really doubting yourself, doubting your sense of reality, because you're seeing these things, but not everybody else is seeing these things. So for neurodivergent people, that will often be things like being told that you're just a bit lazy, or you're just being difficult, when actually it's a communication difference or it's an executive function difference. Expectations of rejection. So when we have these experiences as somebody in a minority group, we grow an expectation that we're going to be rejected, and often that is played out and reinforced because of the actual genuine rejection that is happening. Stigma concealment. So the ways in which we try to conceal that stigma, the ways in which we try to mask, try to appear as comfortable, as calm, as fitting in. And then internalized stigma as well. So all of the crap that we absorb from society, stigmatizing that particular experience of identity, we cannot help but absorb that. That just happens. We all absorb these things when we're kind of given those messages left, right, and center. And of course, it's important here to consider intersectionality as well. So, when we think about everyday discrimination or prejudice events, those are going to be heightened and probably more frequent if you're in that double minority group. So if you're autistic and you're also a person of colour, you are way more likely to get stopped by the police, because they already have a discrimination, a bias around people of colour. And they often have biases around autistic behaviour, reading as suspicious as well, because it's not, you know, quote unquote normal. So poor eye contact, for example, could be read see, even I'm doing it. This is my internalized stigma. I'm calling it poor ay contact. That is a value judgment. It's not poor eye contact, it's different eye contact. That's what I should be saying. There you go, you can see it in action. And then on the other hand, that kind of balances out with resilience resources. So identity, valence and integration, so how integrated our sense of identity is in our sense of self, how comfortable we are with that, how kind of fluid it is, mastery over things, feeling that we have skills, that we have abilities, general coping strategies, social support, community connectedness. Now, of course, a lot of these are really extra difficult for many neurodivergent people. So accessing social support, accessing a connection to community can be a real extra challenge if you're neurodivergent and you have this difference in communication, and you know, most autistic folks, as a result of that, have a huge amount of social anxiety that they have to wrestle with. So being able to connect with your community, speaking for myself, the times when I've managed to do that, I've managed to kind of mask that quite well and get involved in stuff, but it is masking. So people might feel connected to me, but I don't necessarily feel connected to them in that situation. Not all the time, of course, but it's an extra hurdle. And so it makes it difficult, more difficult perhaps, to build up these resilience resources to counteract these stresses. And then, of course, the kind of balance of that, the scale of that, results in different health outcomes. And that could be mental health, as we've seen in the previous slide. It could be physical health. It could be psychological and social well-being. And also risky behaviour as well is influenced by this kind of balance. So just a little kind of further thought, I suppose, about intersectionality. So this is the charts that we usually put in. You can see there's this axis of domination. So on the top side of the axis, you have privilege, society, normative things. So things like language bias, being towards people who speak English as a first language, colorism, that bias towards light or pale skin, anti-Semitism, that bias towards Gentiles or non-Jews, politics of appearance, our social privilege that we afford to people who are attractive, ageism, people who are young. And then on the other side of the spectrum, you have the kind of opposite end of that spectrum. So, so the sort of oppressed opposite to that. So you know, obviously with ageism, you've got older people, politics of attraction, people who are considered generally to be more unattractive, people of non-European origin, all of these sorts of things. So you can see there's lots of different examples of this. In this particular example, neuromajority and neurominority have been added in because they were not in the original one. Because what tends to happen when we have conversations around these things, it's getting a lot better now, is that we talk simply about disability. And of course, as Ruth was saying, not all neurodivergent people will identify with the concept of disability for themselves. But also when we talk about disability, there's usually an assumption that we're talking about a physical disability, we're talking about able-bodiedness, or we're talking about mental health issues. And neurodiversity is neither of those things, not in and of itself.
Lovely. Thank you, Danny. I just kind of following up a little bit from what you said, a couple of thoughts that came to my mind. I mean, one of the things is that as the years have rolled on, I have found myself talking more and more about issues of society when I'm working with clients, because I think it is just so profound. And when you're working with someone one-on-one or in a couple or in a family, it's so easy to get kind of zoned in to the individual when actually, my God, you know, the network, the intricate network of what influences our way of being, as Danny just kind of outlined, is vast. And we need to be able to have an understanding of how those factors are influencing the people that we are working with, the people that we love, ourselves. There's a great book that's written by another neurodivergent academic called Robert Chapman, called Empire of Normality, which I would recommend to anybody. It is it's a fascinating examination of the current society that we're in, and ideas of normality and ideas of how we should be behaving, and then what happens if you don't fit into that. So I think it's a really useful read about the concepts that we've been talking about. It's focusing specifically on neurodiversity, but it's the themes within it, the broader scope of it is relevant for most minority identities as well. So let's think about existentialism a bit. You know, as Danny and I mentioned at the beginning, it's something that interestingly we both came to in very different ways, but intuitively fit. There was a sense of like clicking in terms of how I understood and experienced neurodivergence, and the existential concepts and an existential kind of way of looking at life and looking at what it means to be human. Now, why do I think it's helpful when we think about neurodivergent, when we think about queer people? Well, one of the things is because it looks at humanness, it looks at what's going on outside of a medical model. And of course, both for LGBTQIA+ and for neurodivergent people, there is a long history and an existing experience of pathologization, that there is something wrong with you. And that the effect of that, the profundity of that, I don't think can be underestimated, really. And that's something that I think, you know, it just is. It's a huge thing to kind of grow up, even if you haven't been diagnosed till later in life. The norms that you are surrounded by have a massive influence, even if those norms have not as yet been given a name. And so being able to have a way of examining who you are outside of that, I think is so important. Also, with existentialism, we are all about that tension between the uniqueness and the universality. You know, it's all about that. It's about the fact that, you know, we have, you know, our humanness that connects us, and yet we also have our individual thrownness that is entirely our own. So being able to wrestle with that, particularly when you're dealing with people who have often a very unique experience, often an experience that can feel isolating, I think is really helpful. Philosophical connections. One of my joys is being able to have conversations with my clients where we will have a good old philosophical discussion about something or other, because as yet there is no research to date, I don't believe, on this, but a lot of neurodivergent folks have a real kind of philosophical way of thinking about the world, a real kind of curiosity in terms of looking beyond the initial, the superficial, and seeking for and intuitively reaching out to the things that are beneath, the things that are broader, the things that are deeper. And so being able to have a framework where you can talk about that stuff and discuss that, I think it is often super helpful. And the other aspect of it is that, you know, the existential psychotherapy is a very broad church, which is, again, rather joyous. We have the ability to pretty much do whatever we want if we've got a good rationale for it and it makes sense. You know, there isn't a sense of needing to do things in a certain way, in a certain time scale. And we'll talk about this later on, but that flexibility and crucially that relational approach is a game changer, an absolute game changer for many people who come from who are neurodivergent and queer. So picking up on a few gorgeously existential themes, so let's dive right into freedom and anxiety. One of the things that is often talked about is the fact that neurodivergent folks find it difficult to make choices. So it's, if you kind of have discussions within kind of clinical settings, it's something that gets talked about a lot. And there's a real truth to that. It can be paralyzing. You know, I work with lots of people who, you know, having to make a decision around, you know, what shoes to buy or what washing machine to buy is entirely paralyzing. And it might mean that they just, you know, they wear the same shoes that they've worn for 20 years. You know, this is not uncommon. And yet, as soon as we look at that from an existential lens, it really shifts the way we see things. Because, you know, as Kierkegaard beautifully highlighted, we are in a state of anxiety. There is no kind of predetermined route. We are constantly experiencing choices without any idea of what those choices are going to lead to. That is the reality of being human. And so for me, and I know Danny and I have spoken about this many times, the fact that neurodivergent folks can really struggle to make choices and feel a great deal of anxiety on an everyday level is a consequence of the fact that they are in greater connection to this reality of the precariousness of our existence. So they are aware of, often in a constant way, of the fact that there is a lack of certainty. Solero talks about how humans can end up hiding in absolutisms. So we hide in uncertainty as a way of protecting ourselves against the anxiety of what it means to constantly be having to deal with these choices that we're making, this uncertainty that we're stepping in. And that's one of the things that for some neurodivergent folks, they just don't do. So I have clients where, you know, I might say, "Oh, I'll see you next week." And they'll reply, "Well, you don't know that, Ruth. There's absolutely no certainty that you can give me that you are going to be here next week." And of course, that's absolutely right. That's absolutely right. It's just a lot easier for me not to think about that. And I think there's sometimes the scale of that is really hard to hold. And so no wonder it's really anxiety provoking. But what's further kind of debilitating is when that's then classed as neurotic or classed as being overly sensitive. And these are terms that are bandied about so frequently. Just don't worry about it. You're just overly sensitive. When actually, from an existential point of view, these people are correct. And being able to identify that, have discussions about that, be honest about the reality of that, in and of itself can be profoundly helpful and healing. It doesn't change the reality, but it stops them from thinking that there's something profoundly wrong within them, which is the message that gets kind of repeatedly told. I'm sure you will recognize these two people. So we've got Greta Thunberg and we've got Chris Packham. For me, it is absolutely no surprise that both of these people, who are kind of in the vanguard of highlighting issues around environment and the precarious state we are in at the moment, are both autistic. There is often a profound connection to fairness, to what is important, to justice, for lots and lots of neurodivergent people, that entirely supersedes kind of standard norms around, you know, what they should do with their life. I don't know if any of you saw Chris Packham's recent documentary. He talks very controversially about, you know, how far does he push it in terms of, you know, trying to deal with the environmental issues we have and the issues we have in terms of climate change. And he's like, you know, is it legitimate for him to break the law? Because actually what we're dealing with here is the death of our planet. You know, how do I deal with this? So he is articulating it's a great documentary, but in a really kind of clear way, you know, all of these things that we're supposed to do, these things are not important in the grand scheme of things. And actually we need to be touching base with what it means, what's really important. So for lots of neurodivergent folks, this awareness of fairness, of justice, of what's correct, can supersede ideas around social norms. And of course, Danny's going to talk about Nietzsche in a moment, because when we think about existentialism, one of the big things is to do with, you know, the kind of herd instinct and the natural instinct for humans to kind of go along with the social narratives and norms that we are surrounded by, even if that means detaching from, hiding from what we are really experiencing, who we really are, that authentic way of being in the world. And why do we do that? Well, you know, Heidegger highlights that we do that because trying to be authentic all the time is jolly hard. trying to actually connect in the work in a way that is real, that is honest, is extremely difficult. And so again, I think having that awareness of what it means if you are a neurodivergent person, and the way that you see the world is in this way, where there isn't the ability to just kind of hide in a little bit of social performance, I think is really important. Danny, do you want to just jump in and do a little bit on?
Yes, I'm going to do a tiny bit on old Nietzsche because I'm conscious of the time, and I thought we got an hour and a half. It's great. We'll have a little space, but we ramble and we get very passionate about stuff, and we have taken up so much time. I want to have some time for questions. Yes, so sure. That being said, Nietzsche, love him, terrible misogynist, hate that part. But he has some very insightful things to say around this idea of the herd instinct. So this was one of the things that he wrote about a lot, this idea that we all follow the herd or the group. We're held together by these shared norms, by these normative scripts that we're kind of born into, and we adopt them, and we kind of just unthinkingly follow them because that's safe, because having the strength to separate ourselves from the herd and shun that mentality in order to be authentic, as Ruth said, is jolly hard. And these herds are everywhere. Even groups of rebels are kind of groups of herds. So we kind of instinctively find ourselves falling in with the herd, just kind of non-reflectively following through. And then Nietzsche sort of writes about this crucialness of trying to extract oneself from the herd and go in one's own direction rather than just following those norms, to really consider them, to consider the impact that they're having, and to actively choose what we opt into, whether that is something that, you know, is introduced to us by a herd, or whether that's something that we come to individually. So it's this real sense of aspiring to express more individuality, but acknowledging that that is extremely difficult. Now, I think that this is probably the main reason why there is this link between neurodivergence and queerness, because neurodivergent people actually often don't naturally fall in with the herd. That's why we have a lot of social struggles. We don't instinctively tune into that. And actually, we look at it and think, well, that's all a bit silly, really. I don't think I want to tune into that. And that causes us all sorts of problems. So I think if you're starting from that position and you're seeing the absurdity and stuff, and actually the nuance and the range of stuff available to you, you're much more likely to claim a different kind of identity because you're not following that script. I say that as somebody who came out really comparatively late in life, so clearly I was following that script, but I got there eventually, so it's okay. Well, so that's all I'll say about it.
Yeah. You're in a good club there. So just a couple of points, and then we're going to talk about a few notes about applications to practice, and we will pause and make sure we have time for a few questions at least. So really the only bit I want to highlight here is just the fact that this not being able to kind of hide in the precariousness of hide from the precariousness of our existence, not being able to hide in the comfort of social convention, can mean that for lots of autistic and neurodivergent folks more broadly, there is big questions around self, often a sense of nothingness that can even be kind of on a physical, kind of struggling with the embodied sense of oneself, as well as this experience that Danny's talked about of masking, but an awareness of that masking and of trying to find oneself within that masking. And I wanted to, again, just briefly mention around kind of liminality and neuroqueering. Neuroqueering is a term created by the fabulous neurodivergent academic Nick Walker. And it means the practice of queering, so subverting, defying, disrupting, liberating oneself from neuronormativity and heteronormativity simultaneously. So it's a development from the idea of queering, and it's this idea of actually starting to really subvert all the stuff that Danny was talking about. Mark Balaz, who is a colleague of Danny and I, and again, superb, always recommend Mark's books, talks about this idea of liminality and the fact that people who are queer, people who are neurodivergent, move in this in-between worlds. Danny's talked about it as edge walking, and I really love that term. This sense of you are not kind of within, but you are moving on the edges, shifting in and out, seeing beyond social narratives, but also that can mean that seeking connection whilst in a kind of relational liminality, whilst in these in-between states, can be really challenging. And for me, this is one reason why therapy can be so important, because it can be the chance to talk about how to understand oneself and how to understand relationships as well, but not having to become something other than your liminal in-between state. You know, being able to hold all of that stuff, and therapy can provide that space to do that. Just a few things about neurodivergent and queer informed therapy. So the first thing to say, and Robert Chapman and Monique both are actually, who we've already spoken about, did a fabulous article specifically on this. So that's another one to look out for. And basically one of the big things is reconceptualizing that the dysfunction is relational rather than individual. So it's not that we have a broken, abnormal, neurodivergent queer person. It's that we have a human being who is having to deal with all of the, complex things of being a human being within the society that we have. So one of the things is taking that kind of pathologizing individual perspective away. And then, the other thing is to do with an awareness around stigma and an awareness around also acceptance and pride. There's a lovely kind of movement in terms of embracing kind of neurodivergence, not in any way minimizing difficulties, but allowing space for celebration in the same way, as well as allowing space for celebration of LGBTQIA plus identities. Let's touch on two of these, and then I think we'll pause for a bit because we are finishing up at past, aren't we, Natalie? Lovely. So phenomenology, which is that aspect of existential work, all to do with exploring the other person's experience in a way that is as curious, as open as possible, I think is really important when we're working with individuals like this. A colleague of mine was doing a work with autistic and ADHD boy, and initially in their sessions, it was just him stimming away, doing all sorts of fabulous stimmy sensory things that he needed to do, and being supported and allowed and encouraged and joined in with. And for that person, that experience, they spoke about it later, was the one time where they were able to really be themselves. And there's something about having that open attitude of inquiry, as well as really scaffolding the individual to be able to engage with their humanity in that way, that I think is absolutely central. Danny, do you want to touch on this, and then we can maybe
Yeah, sounds great. So a part of existential working is recognizing limitations and givens, the things that we can't change, perhaps the challenges, the limitations that we're up against. And this is really important when working with neurodiversity. So acknowledging someone's neurodiversity is not the same as pathologization. In fact, it can be super important and validating experience to recognize the genuine limitations that being neurodivergent places in one's life. So there's often this kind of narrative around neurodiversity where people try to like massively play it down, and then they get upset. This happens with queerness too, actually. Where they kind of play it down and often, I've had this a few times, get accused of kind of making a label their identity. So this idea of trying to downplay it. There's also a narrative that often comes up around neurodiversity of thinking of it as a superpower. which is kind of equally toxic, because yeah, okay, being neurodivergent means that you might have certain advantages, certain things that you're really good at. We all have certain things that we're really good at. But you know, there are also very real limitations there, and just thinking of it as this sort of relentlessly affirming approach can be quite damaging, because actually a big part of the experience of neurodivergence is these limitations, these things that we just really struggle to do, and we keep telling ourselves, I'm going to get better at that one day, I'm going to learn how to do it, and it never happens. That's why I've got a massive pile of laundry in my room that I have not sorted through for months, because I do not have the executive function, and I'm probably never going to get the executive function. And also it's a sensory issue, so lots of stuff going on there. So acknowledging the limitations in a majority non-autistic or non-neurodivergent society is super, super important. And recognizing what the consequence is of that for people who are different, and the same, of course, for queerness, recognizing the limitations, the struggle of living in a heteronormative society, and the very real limitations and barriers that that places in the way of somebody who doesn't fit into that. So we'll pause there and go for some question and answers, because otherwise it's just us rambling and no space.
I know, indeed. Well, so with your questions and answers, feel free to pop them in the chat, or you can put your hand up, whatever you feel most comfortable with.
My face has gone the same colour as the wall. That's
I know, it's beautifully matching though. I'm loving that. I love a match. I love a match.
I'm going to consider it that I'm coordinating.
You are coordinating. Good work. Good work. Whilst we wait for people to gather their thoughts, just to say that one of the kind of really key things for me about working with neurodivergent and queer folks is to do with that real kind of relational authenticity. I've you know, in my kind of chats with friends and family and clients, one of the things that often comes out is that if they are met with a professional who's very much trying to be professional and is kind of putting that, you know, little show on of their kind of expertise, that just does not fly. That just does not fly, because all of the stuff that we've talked about today highlights that stuff is superficial nonsense. We don't want that. We want you as you are, being authentic with me in this space. And I think, you know, that can sometimes be confronting. It can be emotional. It can be, you know, tricky, but it also can be, I mean, it's from as far as I'm concerned, it's the only way to do it. But certainly when working with this client group, I think preparing yourself for radical authenticity, that is the name. That is the name of the word.
Which means a lot of admitting when you make a mistake.
Yes.
And not just trying to bullshit your way through.
On a daily, Danny, on a daily. Any thoughts, any comments, any reflections, or any questions?
Just while I wait for people to have a think and kind of let it absorb, because obviously you shared so much, I just want to thank both of you so much, so much. You've had me think, you've had me laugh, you've had me nearly cry. I'm so angry by some of what you're really highlighting in such an articulate way. So honestly, it's so moving. I'm so grateful. I'm not going to ramble because it can, and I'm full of emotion. But yeah, I think we've already got a question in the chat. I know Ruth is very good at grabbing questions as well in my role as well, so it's nice to see she's going to do that as well. But yeah, I think there's a couple of things in the comments.
So I was looking over there, not because I was ignoring you, I promise, but because I was trying to find my books, because we've had a question about resources for neurodivergent LGBTI folks in terms of relationships. There's some really fabulous books that have come out recently. There's one to do with autistic and trans experience. There's a couple to do with queerness and neurodivergence. There's one that's come out recently just about relationships. So they're out there now. I mean, it's only been in the last few years, but it's fantastic, and they're written by neurodivergent queer folks, and so there's some really useful things. If for any reason you can't find them, Tim, feel free to email me. I'll pop my email in the group chat, and I'm very, very happy for anyone to reach out to us if you've got any questions or you've got any requests for resources and stuff, Danny, I'm super happy to always do that.
There's
Thank
a
you.
very good one called The Autistic Trans Guide to Life, which is by Yen Perkis and Wen Lawson, which I would definitely recommend.
Shelley.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's actually, I think someone's put something in the chat about disclosure. I haven't looked at it, but I was wondering, with disclosure, and I know that often we're told it depends if the client will benefit from you disclosing something, but being queer and neurodiverse, if a client asked you if you were neurodiverse or queer, would you say yes? Or would you voluntarily offer that in a way, not to make it about you? Obviously, that's not what any of us want, because it's about the client, but to make them feel that you have your understanding and your experience.
I mean, certainly, it's a great question, Shelley. Thanks for asking it. Certainly, if they were to ask me directly, I would absolutely answer that honestly, 100%. I will often, if it feels right, I will often offer it as well. And I think sometimes because there can be such feelings of shame, such profound feelings of shame, that I think there can sometimes be something really helpful to know that you're in a space where it's safe. There's a sense of, or there's a sense of a sameness or knownness. I think, yeah, particularly with some of my younger clients who are kind of, late teens, where they're really kind of grappling with what it means to be them, and there's just deep, deep, deep shame around who they are, and often I'll do that in a way, my own kind of dyslexia. I'm dyslexic. That's often pretty obvious from the first email you'll get from me. As Danny can attest to. So there's in a way I can't hide it, so I don't, but I think obviously we're centering the client's experience. It's not, I don't want it to be my show, but I do think it's important. Danny, your thoughts?
Well, I mean, I'm very open about my various identities in all of the stuff that I put out there, basically for the reasons that you described. Really, I want to indicate that it's a genuinely safe space for people that they can come to, and that if that's important for them, because perhaps they're exploring those aspects of their identity, or they just want to sit in a neuroqueer affirming space, that's what they're looking for, then they know, my sort of torch is on, so they can find me. Obviously I've got my pronouns up, so that gives it away pretty quickly as well. But I'm thinking about an experience that I had with a client, an autistic client, where we've been working together for a long time. And one of the things that often happens, I think, with pretty much every autistic client I've ever had, is this little dance about how are you going to start sessions? Because the standard ways of which you start sessions or start any conversation is through this very kind of neurotypical exchange of, how are you? I'm all right. How are you? That bit before you get into the meat of the work. And after a long time of working with this person, we are now both comfortable to sit in silence while he sets up a screen share, because he has to draw while he talks in order to process. And it's absolutely fine for us to both sit there and say nothing until that's set up. And he said to me this evening, which I was very touched by, he said, we were sitting in silence while he did that, and he said, do you know what? It's actually really a relief and really refreshing to sit in a space where I don't have to talk, and I know that it's okay to do that and that I'm not being judged. And at that point I said to him, it's absolutely okay, and I prefer it too. Because it's also about making sure that there's not that power dynamic, right? That it's not me shelving my needs for him, but that there's a recognition there that actually we're sitting in a space which is affirming and helpful for the two of us. It's not like I'm sitting there uncomfortably dealing with his stuff for him. It's absolutely fine to be in that space together. So there are definitely times, I think, where it can be helpful to have that disclosure, and actually kind of puts you on the same page, the same understanding.
Thank you both.
Thanks so much, and a huge thank you for people who've popped your comments. They are they're so meaningful, that they mean so much to Danny and I. They really do. So thank you so much for coming. I think, hold on, have we got, no, I'm just checking. Yeah, no, I think we're good. Okay, are there any resources for people who suspect they might be neurodivergent and need help figuring it out? There's some interesting, quite a few interesting novels. There's also some great YouTubers that I would definitely recommend. How to ADHD is one. Purple Ella is another really good one. And they're really lovely as a way of kind of looking into things and hearing from someone who is themselves neurodivergent, but also is really accessible.
Yes.
Again, if you want more, you ping me an email.
And a second question there around self-diagnosis and how that is perceived within neurodivergent communities. Neurodivergent communities as a whole, massive generalization, of course, are pretty kind of pro and accepting of self-diagnosis for all sorts of reasons. You know, it's firstly, if you're kind of, you know, thinking a lot about potentially not being neurotypical, the chances are you're probably not neurotypical. But also diagnosis can be really hard to access. You're not necessarily going to be able to get it or get it quickly, particularly if you're an older person. It's really hard to get because you need caregivers from when you were young to be able to fill in most of the questionnaires, and that's just not available to some people. So in general, the neurodivergent community is really affirming around self-diagnosis, and it's basically accepted as completely and utterly valid. So don't let it be something that stops you from participating in wonderful neurodivergent communities, because actually you'd probably be welcomed with open arms. So yeah, it's not really seen as an appropriation of neurodivergent identity. It's a pretty welcoming bunch, really, in general. Some exceptions, of course, because humans.
Lovely.
Well, we have to recognize the time, unfortunately, but we've had lots of comments, which are including a comment that we have here, which says, I would have loved to know more about the existential part and about the therapy part. So I sneakily wrote in the comment, maybe we need to organize a follow-up event. Obviously haven't spoken with Ruth and Danny yet, but maybe it's something I'll slip in at some point, and we can see about that. I mean, obviously it would be lovely to have you back, and I think this audience and the comments are saying a lot about how valuable what you're sharing is, and I'm sure when there's been time for them to all of us to soak in what you've had, it will be even more so. But yeah, so sadly we must close the meeting for tonight, but it is with absolute gratitude for everybody watching, and for especially Ruth and Danny. Thank you so much for your time and expertise. Thank you
so much. Thanks, everyone.
Take care.
Take care.
Bye.